Our first speaker, Cathy Foley, is a Eureka Prize winner. And I think the first Eureka Prize winner to address the MRC ever. And we've had some very distinguished people. This is a first for us, so we're very honoured. She is Deputy Chief Scientist at the CSIRO's Material Science and Engineering Division. Her particular specialties are superconductors and magnetism. And she's been very active as a promoter of science, including a term as President of the Australian Institute of Physics. It's my great pleasure to introduce Cathy Foley.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for inviting me today, because I don't think I've talked to an audience like this before, and it's pretty exciting because for a long time I think science hasn't actually got it right in being able to express the process and the opportunity that, that science and innovation has in order to make Australia healthy, wealthy and wise, which I guess the organisation I work for is very much focused at. But also one of the things which is really interesting is that pretty nearly every scientist I've ever met in Australia in particular is so committed to doing work that makes a difference. If you ask anyone who is a scientist or a technologist, they say they are doing this because they see their work is really going to make the difference in the future. So if we go through the slides. This is what I'm going to talk about. It's a bit hard. I have to put my glass on so I can see. And that is that I'm going to go through and first of all just have a quick snapshot of the impact of science so far. Look at Australia's place internationally, and I'm not going to go into any great depth in these areas. It's more just to give you a bit of a snapshot. Then I'm going to just briefly talk about how science is done, because there's been a lot in the media with climate change and that sort of stuff about, you know, what science do you believe? And I'm only going to touch on that, but give you an idea of the process. Where science is needed, examples, and I'm going to give some from my own personal experience of where getting science from the laboratory into the marketplace. And then I'm going to go through and give some laundry lists of things where, from a point of view of from a working scientist, what are the issues from where we see, which might be completely naive and completely uninformed in the sense of where you guys sit, where you have to take science, put it together with policy and be able to make something that is able to contribute to the community. So next slide. Okay, most of us don't think about science as being anything other than something nerdy people do wearing white coats. However, every one of you today probably got up, turned on a light, because I know you all get up too early in the mornings, and science has shown that you really do need to have a good sleep to have a good, healthy life. And you probably had a shampoo put shampoo in your hair, had hot water in the shower. You might have, I hope none of you are taking high blood pressure tablets because you're so healthy, but you probably did take some medication of some sort. You then went down and had your Wheat Bix grown from wheat, which probably had some sort of improvement due to science. And so it goes on. Everything you've touched today, even probably the material you're sitting on, the shirt material that you're wearing, is all a consequence of scientific development of some kind. Our world today, every moment of it is touched by science. And so if we go to the next slide, I'm going to go through and just have a bit of a think back in time. Australia really has had enormous benefit from science, and these are some of the good old ones, like myxomatosis development for rabbits. The other one is, have I got that? Yeah, the cactoblastis moth that got rid of the prickly pears, which those of us who are a bit older can remember from our youth. The development by Alan Walsh of the atomic mass absorption spectrometer, which is every single chemistry laboratory in the world has one of these. What you're looking at there is the work that was done at CSIRO during World War II on development of radar. And at the end of World War II, they thought, well, we don't want to do radar anymore, because they formed DSTO to separate out defence and civilian research. And they thought, oh, let's point it up into the sky and look at the stars. And that's where radio astronomy came from. And Australia is world leader in that. This is a really good example of us saying, well, why are we doing something like that? Where's the benefit? Your Wi-Fi is a consequence of radio astronomy. It's something which is unintended, but a consequence of research where we didn't really plan for it, but my goodness, hasn't it made a huge impact worldwide? And then, did you know your permanent press trousers were developed by the Geelong labs in CSIRO? I work for CSIRO, if you don't know, and it's And so our permanent press trousers are from the textile work that's been done over many years. So. And more recently, I guess food security is a major issue and something which we have to rethink again. And I've got a few examples in that area. But Australia has an enormous track record in research and investment that's seen to huge productivity in the agricultural sector. And that's an example with the jump stump plough, which revolutionised the way we dug up our very dry earth, through to the Holden ute, which is part of the transport solution for farmers, and then finally just the things that are being done over and over again to improve the biological things like wheat, so that we're able to. We all know William Farrer and the wheat stuff there. Keep going. I've put up there a huge long list of things which are examples just in 2 areas alone of health, which we, from cochlear ear implants to Gardasil to Relenza flu drugs, through to the other side, which is manufacturing, which is my own research area, which leads into manufacturing. And you've got here the banknotes you carry in your wallet are a consequence of research in Australia, and that's used all around the world. Solar cells, which are being developed in both China and in the USA, but Australia is getting return on that investment through licensing. They are a consequence of research in Australia. Cotton, Nulka, which is a defence, a small probe which actually is able to go and be able to attract missiles towards it rather than into a boat, and that's something which is developed in Australia. And for example, the US Defence Forces have just decided to put $2 billion into buying those. What else? We've got a huge involvement in mineral exploration, which I'll touch on in a moment because that's my own research area, and I'll use that as an example. Next slide. So. Let's think about Australia's doing all that work. It's got some examples of good success where there's been benefits and ones which we can easily track. But we've got to put it into context. Australia does 3% of the world's research. That means there's 97% of it which we don't actually do on our lands. So that doesn't mean that we should be necessarily worrying about that, although it's important that we do enough research because Australia does have very unique problems, which I've listed there. We are a small population, but in an enormous land area. We have a very dry continent. We have a long distance to markets, and so it does mean that the situation in Australia is very different to any other country in the world. And so therefore it's not as though we can just assume that any research that we need we can always get from overseas, apart from the sovereignty need to have some inside knowledge and the opportunities in economic development. But the other is, though, if we want to capture and take hold of that or access that 97%, we have to really understand our place in the world and be able to connect and collaborate internationally. And that is in some ways you could think of it as getting that extra mileage or leveraging the work and research we're doing here by connecting internationally. And there's some real opportunities there. And I think, Thomas, you're going to possibly touch on that. Is that right? Anyway, he's an expert in that area. I just want to raise that, though, as one of the issues to think about. Let's keep going. Now I want to talk about how science is done. And that is quite often, and I love this quote from David Suzuki, who you might know as the Canadian environmentalist, and that is that a lot of people don't realise that science is really hard. It is really hard, painful and difficult to achieve a really good outcome. And I'll just read out that quote, and that is that science does not progress in an easy, linear fashion. It's not like you have an idea, set up an experiment, and prove your theory, and then cure cancer. In science, you learn as much from your failures as you do from your successes, and every paper, every theory, and every experiment builds on those that came before. And as Isaac Newton says, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And if you go into Google, and then you go into Google Scholar, which gives you the entree or portal into the research world and journal papers, you will see their byline is standing on the shoulders of giants. And that is that science is never done on its own. It's done as part of a team, it's done as part of an international network, and every time one person does something and they publish a paper, the rest of the world is able to see it and actually build on it. And I've got a little example of where that's happened in the past, for me personally. But so science isn't just do the experiment and suddenly we know all the answers. It's actually much more complex than that. And from things like understanding all the issues around climate change, which I hope we don't get bogged down in today because that's just one little thing. But even in my own research area, you do an experiment on something, you think you've got the idea of what the answer is, and you're following down a pathway, and then suddenly you realise that you didn't actually understand. You don't know what you don't know until you actually go through the experiment, and then you have to keep diverting and getting to a point where you're building information and drift towards an understanding. It's not a direct pathway with a clear step-by-step process, which must be very infuriating for people who are funding science, saying, I put money into this research, why haven't I got an answer? And that is because it's a little bit like the stock market. We have a general drift in a particular direction, but you're going to have ups and downs. And you're going to have times where if you take a little snapshot and look at one part of it, it might give you a really false idea of the whole big picture. And that's a really tricky thing about science. It's very easy for someone who only knows a little bit about something to come in and say, you've got it wrong there. And maybe you do in that particular bit, but in the whole big picture, you've got to take it on board. And the next thing is publishing papers, and I've just put this up here. A lot of people don't realise that there is a very important part of saying, is the science right? And this is this unbelievably painful process called the peer review process, where I write up a paper which is sort of like that science report you did at school, but then you actually, instead of sending it into your teacher, you send it to your peers via a journal, and you don't even know which peers they are, and they look at it and they go through it, and it is really very painful. In fact, it's one of those most difficult parts of being a scientist, because it's nothing like being dumped on for everything. You've put your heart and soul into something, you think this is exactly the work which is absolutely right, you submit it, and another brain comes in and looks at it and saying, oh no, actually I don't think you've taken that on board properly. And so it's a very difficult process to get to a point where a paper is published. Next slide. Science, though, has the potential to be a major way of finding a way forward for a range of different things that are very big on the agenda of all communities, especially in Australia. I've got a big list there, such as ageing, health, what else is transport, energy, communications. But just to give two examples. Ageing. Many of us are hoping that we'll live to a ripe old age. But unfortunately, about 50% or more, and I was hoping to check this statistic, but it's a very large number of people by the time they get to 80 have actually got Alzheimer's or dementia. So if we're going to live to an old age, and many of us are getting to that stage, we're going to a point where our life quality is not there, and also we're going to get to a point where the impact on the health system is huge as well because of that. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we were able to understand how the brain worked, how Alzheimer's affects us, or can we actually get to a point where we can repair the brain? And already work is heading towards that, and it's almost like this idea of having a bionic brain where you can put electronics into and embedded in the brain in order to redo your memory. In fact, you know, in Harry Potter, there's that thing where you have the pensieve, where the wizard puts his thoughts from the past into the pensieve and then pulls them out when he wants to. The time will come when we'll be able to download our thoughts and our memory into something which then we can feed back again. Now, that's only at the very preliminary stages, but it's going to have an enormous impact on health. And then on the other extreme is something around agriculture. And I think, have I got the next? No, go back to this. But agriculture is an area where our need and requirements for agriculture are changing. And as I'll show in a later slide, the chances of us actually being able to conquer the issues relating to good food supply in a country where the weather is changing, where there's different needs because of, from whether it's we eat too much and get fat and make ourselves sick, through to just supplies when we have disastrous occasions like we've had this year and this summer. All those things are all working towards something that needs science direction to inform what direction to take. I'm going to very quickly give you an example, and this is my science experiment, or my science background. Sort of superconductivity is my area of research, and as much as I'd like to teach you all about quantum physics and the stuff that goes with it, I'll pass over, other than, if you press the button again, it's 100 years since it was discovered. Superconductors are a material which, if you cool them to a low temperature, they change their properties quite significantly. And one of them is you can make MRI machines with large magnets. Another is you can make a very small structure that allows you to detect very small magnetic fields. And next slide shows about 25 years ago, there was a huge, big explosion in excitement with superconductivity because of the discovery of what they call high-temperature superconductors. These are materials which could be cooled with liquid nitrogen, which means that you can use them more easily. It doesn't really matter about those details. I started working in CSIRO at that time in that area, and I did two things. One was I made a grain boundary. See that thing up there? That line down the middle at the top there, that's about a nanometre wide. It's about the width of an atom wide. And with that structure, I'm able to detect very small magnetic fields. So I had to go through the process of putting it into a structure and making a little device, which is about the size of a postage stamp, that allows you to detect the magnetic fields, for example, that come from your brain and your heart. Yep. So what we did was go to the next step, and here they are through one side making a system which is in a plastic box, which is a laboratory system, through to the other side, which is a commercial system. And if you go to there, now if you go onto the website, you too can buy one of my systems which is being commercialised. Now, wouldn't it be nice to say, wasn't that easy? However, look at the next slide. It was a torturous path. First of all, the minerals industry didn't want to know that we could find their nickel sulfide deposits more easily, and they actually preferred the more traditional one. And using cryogenics out in Western Australia in the in the Pilbara is something that they didn't necessarily want to do, or they're a bit nervous about. So if you look here, that's a timeline which goes through all the different steps we had to go from our discovery right through to going and engaging with the industry over and over again. And if we go to the next slide, there's a detail which I won't go into because of time, but the main thing is that we actually had to interact with lots of different companies to get buy-in. And we also needed to go through and go back and redo things over and over again until we got the industry to see there was value in this. And they got to a point now where they actually do believe there's value in it, so that this system which I developed, just the person with the grain boundary putting it into a device, into a system that's then commercialised and licensed out, has actually discovered $6 billion worth of nickel sulfide deposit mines all around the world. And that's from just one project in my organisation. And this comes back to the whole business, which is really difficult for people who are in policy development, is who do we fund? Do we pick winners, or do we back track record? And I don't know that there's a solution to this, and maybe it's a mixture of the two. But there's something really interesting to look at. The first one is examples overseas. Germany actually invested in backing the winners of let's put a whole lot of money into biotechnology. Now, I don't know whether you notice that Germany isn't seen as the biotechnology country of the world. Well, the USA actually backed their best people, and they actually have had a much better success in biotechnology research.